Daily chart challenges are a massive thing on Reddit. Every day, someone will make a post asking which characters or pieces of media would fit into a certain category. It could be to fill in a fake Smash roster, or an alignment chart of some kind, or to put things into neat categories. But the main thing is that it's always voted for by the people of Reddit. One thing I've never personally seen, however, is one where you try to assign different characters to all the possible Pokémon type combinations. The reason for this is obvious. There are a lot of types, 18 of them, and that means it would take a long time to actually fill the thing out if you're doing all of the type combinations, and who has time for that? Me. It's me, I have the time. I decided to take to Reddit and post every day asking which Nintendo character would fit a specific type combination, and see which option was the most popular. This took me almost half a year, and I did put a lot of work into it. So I figured that I might as well put some more work on top of that by making a video about it as well. That wasn't actually my original plan, but I wanted to talk about some of the choices that were made and some of the fun things that happened on this massive journey. So here were the rules of the game. Every day I would make a post asking which Nintendo character would fit a certain type combination. People would give me their suggestions, and the character that got the most votes would be put into this handy little chart I cooked up. For a comment to be the winner, it has to be clear which specific character is nominated. If not, then I would just move on to the next highest comment. Only official Nintendo characters were allowed, so no fan-made or third-party characters. The line on what should and shouldn't count is kinda hard to determine, but in the end, after discussion with many participants, I decided that characters like Geno and Robo Mario are allowed, but characters like Rabbid Peach and Bayonetta are not. The characters have to be some form of sentient or living being, so no inanimate objects, which includes things like the Fire Flower, as it doesn't appear to actually be sentient or alive, and certainly not provably so. Robots typically would count though, as they are often characterised as if they are alive, and vehicles like Divine Beasts that don't have any sort of self-automation are not counted. Also, by character I can mean species. Also, obviously, Pokemon are not allowed because it would kind of defeat the point given they already have canon types. However, Pokemon trainers and non-Pokemon characters from Pokemon are allowed. Obviously, a character cannot be chosen for two separate categories, but that goes for variants as well. If Bowser gets on the chart, Fury Bowser can't then be used elsewhere. The character also has to be a singular character, not a group or a duo. You could choose Olimar just fine, he just can't have any Pikmin with him. So Pyra and Mythra, despite technically being the same character, would both be valid for this, as well as because it's yet another separate character, despite also being the same character. I hope this is making sense to you guys. The main reason for these rules is because I wanted to make sure that we got a variety of characters, not just 10 Marios clogging up the chart. Plus, I don't really want people to start including groups of people in this, even though Pokemon does. It could get out of hand real quick. Finally, I didn't want this to take all year, so I didn't ask about the different ways types can be combined as primary and secondary. I'm treating a Fire Bug Pokemon and a Bug Fire Pokemon as the same. Like, come on, I do have a life and I would like to live it. So with all of that out of the way, it's time to look at what we got in the chart. I'm not going to go through every character, but I'm going to highlight the key moments and maybe talk a bit about what I think of the choices for each type in general. I started off going through all the grass types, and this was an exciting type because there are so many cool plant-based characters under Nintendo's wing, and I was really looking forward to seeing it was all Pikmin. Okay, all is a bit of a stretch, but like, look at this chart, look at it. Literally half of the types ended up getting a Pikmin rep. If I had my time again, I might not have started with the grass type, because it did get a little uninteresting for some people just rocking up knowing that the answer was going to be a Pikmin, but I figured that grass was a good place to start as it's always the first type represented by a Pokemon in the Pokédex of a region. And regardless, I think the fun thing about this era of the chart was that it wasn't actually certain that the Pikmin were all going to make it. There was a little debate on whether purple should be grass ground or grass fighting, and it didn't really seem the best option for either of those, at least not outright like it was for the others. White Pikmin was also on pretty rocky ground, as PT Piranha seemed perfect for grass poison, and heck, I even made the case for PT being grass flying based on his second boss battle in Sunshine, where he flies and creates tornadoes. And in the end, I think it would have been a bit harsh for one type of Pikmin to get left out in the cold, which is probably part of why they got so much support, but I think it was a lot of fun trying to think of alternatives, getting creative with it. But it did seem to come at the expense of the Piranha Plant. Day by day, it seemed like the Piranha Plant was not going to make it onto the list, and given it's the most iconic plant in all of gaming, that would have been a travesty for not a single one to make it. Ice Piranha Plant, Putrid Piranha Plant, Fire Piranha Plant, PT Piranha, all of them had their places stolen. Heck, Dino Piranha got beaten by Azurda from Xenoblade Chronicles, which I don't think anyone was expecting. I also found it funny that the first plant from a Mario game to make the list was Pokey rather than Piranha Plant. That just tickled me. But finally, on the final day, Grass Dark type, Piranha Plant made its debut. Not necessarily the most fitting type, but fitting enough, and frankly, its best possible type combination would have been Pure Grass, a combo taken up by the Great Deku Tree for some reason. You know, the big magical tree. I don't get it either. The Fire type was much more varied, but not uneventful by any means. Firstly, Bowser. It was agreed pretty early on that he was gonna be on the list. The question is, would it be for Fire Dark or Fire Dragon? In every type, the Dark type combination was the last one to be chosen, so it looked like he might take Fire Dragon, but more people seemed to think that he would fit Dark, and Volvagia ended up taking the Dragon spot. Many people even months later still argued Bowser should have gotten the Fire Dragon spot, saying that not all dragon types are literal dragons and he isn't really that evil. But to the first point I say, well yeah, dragon types aren't always literal dragons, but a literal dragon like Volvagia is still a better pick than a character who's not. And to those who say he isn't that evil, he's still pretty evil. Just because he's a good dad and we see him as a bit of a goofball doesn't mean he didn't, I don't know, almost destroy the universe. He's Nintendo's most iconic big bad. He deserves this typing. I also made a pretty big push for Fire Normal to be Mario. After all, while he is a neutral jack of all trades for the most part, he is commonly associated with the Fire type. Games like Smash, Mario Strikers, Mario Kart Double Dash, and some of the RPGs do give him either special moves or inherent powers that are fire-based. But many disagreed and said he should just be pure normal, and he actually ended up getting beaten by Glimmer from Xenoblade. If I had a nickel for every time a Mario character that seemed sure to win got beaten by a Xenoblade character, well, I think you know the rest. Ironically enough, while Xenoblade seemed to be the Mario killer at this point, one of the most notable things about it was the fact that the one character people really wanted to get in on the action, Pyra, just could not catch a break. Pure Fire, Fire Normal, Fire Steel, Fire Fairy, Fire Fighting, Fire Psychic. Time and time again she was nominated, and time again she fell short. She got second place in firefighting, but was ultimately beaten by Captain Falcon. It actually feels crazy that Pyra failed to make it at all, but Glimmer got on there over Mario? I don't even know who Glimmer is. And then there was Morpho Night. Now, granted, the Morpho Night vote did take place on the same day as the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct. People had other things on their mind, and Morpho Night was the lowest rated winner in the whole thing with only 48 votes. But so many people were confused at how he won, as other than the aesthetic factors, not much about him really relates to Fire or Fairy. But that's just how it goes, and there didn't seem to be a lot of great options. I also feel confused as to Hades for Fire Ghost. He feels like he has to be dark in some way. The water type was less eventful. There was some debate over what pure water should actually be, with some people like myself choosing characters like Fluidity's Eddie or Zelda's Morpher because they are literally made of just water. But people pointed out that pure water types are usually just fish, so On Guard got it. Mario Wonder's Smackerel was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one, and it was great to see a few new franchises on the board, such as Animal Crossing, Fire Emblem, and Ever Oasis, somehow. I did take a break during featuring water type, purely because I was going on holiday to Indonesia and wouldn't have access to my PC to make the images. And on April Fool's Day, I did make this post, which I thought was really fun. Also, if you watched my Pikmin playthrough video and wondered why I did what I did there, yeah, this is why. So the water type was relatively straightforward, and then came the normal type. Many of the choices here were straightforward, but the battle for pure normal was tough. You have so many avatar characters like Miis and villagers, as well as icons like Kirby and Goomba. I even threw Master Hand out there, but Mario was always going to take it. After all, this was the entire reason he wasn't chosen for Fire Normal. Despite this, we still got Kirby into Normal Fairy, and Crazy Hand took Normal Dark. There were some other choices I think were great, such as Mr. Grizz and Matt from Wii Sports. But the truly controversial one was Normal Ice, and not for the reason you think. You see, many people nominated the Ice Climbers for that spot, but I pointed out that this went against the rule against groups or duos. And instead of changing tact and just choosing one of the climbers, most people tried to get me to make an exception, which I wasn't going to do because the rules were established, and had they not been what they were, many other characters who were duos or groups might have ended up being chosen earlier. The worst part is, none of the top comments for Ice Climbers actually specified which it was that was being chosen, Popo or Nana. So if I was following the rules as anally as I could, they just wouldn't have made it, and I would have put the Mario Penguin there instead. Of course, I bent the rules slightly by just putting Popo there rather than both of them, so that the general intention of the people's vote was still represented, but people weren't too happy about it still. But that's what it is. The rules were set, we all had to follow them. Ice Climbers are no different. It should also be noted that the Ice Climbers aren't actually naturally a duo. Their only game doesn't actually have them being played together. That's entirely a Smash thing, so it's kind of weird to insist that this is the time to break the rule despite it not being an inherent part of the characters. Same goes for the Duck Hunt Dog and Duck, although people did seem to learn this time and the duck itself was the one nominated without the dog. I also seem to have forgotten to do Normal Steel entirely, not sure how. For Electric type, a lot of people were sure Samus would make it on there, but in the end she never fit more than other characters she was up against, especially Chibi Robo for Electric Steel and Dr. Coil for Electric Fighting. Zocket and Connie both ended up making it here from Brothership, making them, I believe, the most recently debuting characters on this list. Then there was a Paroid and Anode Beetle, which, as we speak, actually sits at a draw, with both characters on 156 votes, although at the time a Paroid was just barely ahead. Oh, and who can forget Krako, who was so incredibly popular that he was basically the only notable nominee at all. Seriously, he got 272 votes. The next highest character was Electric Keith at 11. I think the most controversial pick here was the Guardian from Breath of the Wild, simply because no one was quite sure if it really fit either type. Is it even made of rock? Is its energy source actually electricity? Either way, it did end up getting the most votes, and that's really all that matters. There was also some debate on whether a person who fights ghosts should really be ghost type, but enough people made compelling arguments for Professor Egad that people were convinced for normal ghost. The rock type saw the arrival of another fairly obscure franchise, Dylan. Dylan himself never quite made the list, but somehow the Gold Ram Rock did, which was a great result in my books. Boldgeist was also a pretty huge sweep for rock flying, getting 281 votes and making it one of the highest voted winners. A couple of other patterns started to become obvious. For example, Gore Goron joined Darunia and a regular Goron to be the third Goron on our list. What? We can get 3 Gorons on here, but more than one Piranha Plant is going too far? It's also funny that Earthbound's Talking Rock is there. Was there seriously not another character that has psychic and rock powers? In many ways, the ground type felt a lot more low-key than other types, with the posts not really getting the same traction as the other types. And I think part of this is because when you already have the rock type, the ground type just feels a bit, I don't know, redundant. But there were some interesting moments. For example, there was quite a lot of debate on whether or not the Sandbird from Mario Sunshine would be rock flying or ground flying, although granted, I seem to be the only one arguing for rock. I mean, sand is literally made of rock. Even the sandstorm attack is a rock type. But most people did not agree, and it ended up winning ground flying. Then there was Donkey Kong. I thought this was a really weird choice. Donkey Kong does have some claim to both fighting and ground type, but it's mostly that he punches things and has done boxing in some games outside his series, and that he can make the ground shake. But those two things seem to just be him being strong rather than him having those elemental types. There was quite a lot of back and forth, but through it all he still won, so what do I know, I guess. It was also nice to see Advance Wars getting on the list here. Steel was probably one of the most interesting types here, as most days had some sort of close match or contentious choice. Rob as pure steel, when he's literally made of plastic, was a fun one, although people agreed that we were using the Smash interpretation. Jin actually beat Rundus overnight, meaning I didn't actually have the correct image ready. Whoopsie. And Fi had a pretty tough match with Tiptron, but did end up pulling ahead. There was also some debate on whether Zelda and Link would be disallowed if Phantom Zelda and the Hero Spirit were chosen, and as I said, yes they would be. Hero Spirit and Phantom Zelda didn't make the list. Fractal beating Meta Ridley was also kinda unexpected, although it did seem people were saving Ridley for later down the line. Another pattern that you may have noticed is that, other than Viridi in Grass type, every other Psychic type ended up being from either Earthbound or Golden Sun. This streak would end up being broken in the Ice type, but it was interesting to seeing how popular certain franchises were for certain types in the challenge. I was also shocked at Metalface getting the nod for Steel Dark. I was sure that someone else would take it, but no one really seemed to inspire people enough. And then there was Steel Fighting, where Samus made her debut and, well, this one also felt odd to me. Samus as a Steel type, sure, I can get. As a fighting type? People cited that she's a trained soldier, and sure, that can be a fighting type trait, but it really isn't a very common one. Like, 90% of fighting types are specifically martial arts themed, or at least have a sword. And I don't think there's any ranged fighter in the fighting type that isn't also a close range fighter. I think the issue for me is that characters like Samus could potentially fit a bunch of different types, but they don't fit any of them well enough to really fit into a list like this. Additionally, because they fit so many different types, restricting them to just 2 feels weird. Steel Fighting doesn't really feel like it sums up Samus well, and there were so many excellent options that were brought up outside her. Heck, Arms and Joy Mech Fight alone had a bunch of excellent options, but the runner-up, Harry from Teleroboxer, oh how I wanted him to win that. I think this pick really exposed a fundamental difference in how some people viewed this challenge. Many people felt that getting the biggest icons on somewhere was necessary, and so characters like Luigi or Link were suggested in a lot of places, even if they didn't really fit there well, because people just wanted them somewhere here. This actually ran counter to why I did this challenge in the first place. I find these kinds of things typically boring because it's the same few characters that get brought up every time. Splitting the characters into so many different groups meant that there is a necessity to delve into the more obscure depths, and if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I love seeing obscure franchises and characters getting love. So seeing so many of the types getting lots of obscure characters or cool picks was really great, and then seeing a bunch of characters who barely fit a type taking those spots instead, it just felt like it was turning into another one of those charts that picks the most uninteresting options. Of course, the list ultimately does have a lot of excellent obscure picks, but I do find it interesting how there are 2 very distinct mindsets. You either go into it focusing on the fact that you want the winner to be the most popular and prioritising that, or you go into it focusing on the idea of trying to find the best fit for the type and prioritise that. There ultimately isn't a right or wrong way to do it, but it is interesting seeing how differently many of us viewed it. Then there was the Ice type, and it was relatively straightforward, with most of the options being fairly uncontested. This especially went for the Ice Dragon choice, which was the Ice Dragon. This had a similar dominance to Krakow, although granted other characters like Nadra did still get more than 11 votes. Colgera was also given tough competition from Snowflake Fluttertail, but just about managed to win by a single vote. This was also the first type that didn't introduce a single new franchise, although granted, with the types shrinking as many of their combinations are already used up, that was always going to happen sooner or later. Probably the most surprising addition was Rosalina for Ice Fairy. In fact, the Ice type wasn't the bit that was contested, as she does appear to have been given a vaguely ice-based theming in recent years, with 2 Mario Kart tracks now that are ice-based, and the fact that the Comet Observatory is a comet, and comets are made of ice. No, it was the Fairy type that was contested. After all, cosmic stuff is often psychic type, so should she not be psychic type? Ultimately, I think that the Fairy type and psychic type differ in that the Fairy type is associated with magic, while the psychic type is associated specifically with mental abilities that don't necessarily come from magic. Or, to put it another way, Fairy types are more fantasy based, while psychic types are more sci-fi based, hence why space stuff falls under the psychic type. And under that assumption, Rosalina still fits Fairy type very well, because her abilities are not based on the mind and are certainly not sci-fi based. She is magical through and through. And Clefairy demonstrates that cosmic beings that are primarily magic based will be fairy instead of psychic. I still don't know that Rosalina is the best option for the Ice Psychic type, but she's probably my favourite Nintendo character, so I'm just glad she makes the list. We're starting to get to the point where there aren't many characters to talk about that weren't in the previous types, but Poison type still had some. Princess Shroob was actually a surprise winner, pulling out ahead of Ricky, who was winning at the time. And then there was Wario, who was pushed quite hard for both the fighting and dark types here, but both times he got beaten, by Dark Samus for Poison Dark and by Vodka Drunkensky for Poison Fighting. The latter is technically the same character as Soda Popinski, just renamed, but I decided to use the original name as it was the idea of alcohol being a type of poison to the body that got him his win in the first place. Realistically, the one that missed out here was Inkling. People suggested it for normal poison, pure poison, water poison, even poison fighting, but they never managed to hit the top spot, not even getting many votes at all in some cases. I actually don't understand this at all, especially in the case of pure poison. Inkling's whole thing is that they shoot poisonous ink, and given how iconic they are, and the fact that Splatoon got a few poison type reps, it's kind of crazy to me that it ended up with just one upvote in that category, which, for those who don't use Reddit, is literally the lowest score you can have on a comment without being downvoted. That's insane to me. Granted, Agent 3 did get nominated there and did get 10 upvotes, but that's still a far cry from Master Belch, who won with 176 upvotes. Pure Flying brought up the interesting discussion of what Pure Flying should even really be, considering only 3 Pokemon have ever been given this type combination, 2 being just regular birds, and 1 being the embodiment of wind. Given Rookidee and Corvisquire don't keep their pure typing as they go into their final stage, and regular birds seem to usually end up having the normal type anyway, most seem to agree that Tornadus was a better example of pure flying, so some sort of wind-based creature was likely to win, and indeed, we got Zelda's Zephos in this position. Also, I found it funny that Larkitu's Cloud ended up placing second, beating Larkitu himself. And yes, it was established that the Cloud is not an inanimate object. Other than that, James McCloud was just a really funny choice. I haven't played any of the games he's from, but apparently this has some pretty strong basis because his spirit can possess the Arwing or something. Either way, most people found it funny that he got the ghost type because he's just a dead dad really. Then we get to the bug type. And to answer your question, yes, your eyes do not deceive you. That is the Queen Metroid. We started off by giving pure bug type to Ant, as in literally just an ant from Animal Crossing. Some people questioned whether this breaks the rule about characters having to originate in a Nintendo game because Nintendo didn't invent ants, but the same could be said about the polar bear from Ice Climbers or the ducks from Duck Hunt. Even if they are based on a real-world animal, it's still the game's interpretation of that animal. The rule in question is primarily about making sure that real-life people or characters from other companies don't make the list. But if that rule extended to just any species that exists in the world, then things like new Donkers and Nintendogs wouldn't be allowed, and that just feels weird. So, Ant is allowed. The Ant controversy was not, however, over, as the next day it was pointed out that Ant had been surpassed by Squitter. However, we don't know exactly when Squitter overtook Ant, and as I posted the next day's post late, it was almost certainly not within the 24 hours of the bug post being put up. Additionally, Ant ended up quite quickly taking the lead back, so we maintained Ant as the winner. Also, a regular Ant winning pure bug is the funniest thing imaginable. Then we have the duo of non-bugs that manages to make this list, Agatha and Louie. Agatha had previously had a strong showing in normal bug, but had lost out to Wiggler. I personally think she makes more sense there, because when you combine the normal type with another type, it can indicate that a Pokemon has an association with the type without being fully in that type. So Agatha makes sense for normal bug, because she has an association with bugs while not actually being one herself. However, she does use magical bug attacks in Hyrule Warriors, so Bug Fairy still fits her pretty well. And then there's Louie, who I was not expecting to take the lead for Bug Dark, but here we are. Also, Bugsy followed in the footsteps of Krako and Ice Dragon as being a Kirby character who dominated his type so thoroughly that the top few comments were all him and there was no one else even close. One thing that was quite nice in the Ghost Fairy type was where Satori, Lord of the Mountain from Breath of the Wild, was chosen. Apparently Satori is meant to be a nod to Satoru Iwata, the late president of Nintendo, so that's just a nice thing to get on this chart. However, elsewhere there was an interesting and rather bizarre happening. The Boo was our pure ghost type, and it wasn't hard to argue with. However, I felt like this may have made it less likely that King Boo would take Ghost Dark, a type where there seems to be no better contender, but I was fairly sure it wouldn't actually affect things. Until Ghost Dark type went to Miitopia's Dark Lord, which I was absolutely flabbergasted by. Don't get me wrong, I was backing the Dark Lord, I love Miitopia, but I don't actually see the ghost part. They kinda look like a ghost, but they aren't one, and King Boo is the big bad ghost in Nintendo games. So what happened here? Well, I think having Boo and King Boo there would feel a little bit redundant. It would be like if we had Link on the list, but then we also had Hylian. That's not, by the way, against the rules. Someone could have nominated Hylian if they wanted to, but it feels weird, right? My mathematician self tried explaining it using sets. So Link and Zelda are separate from each other, but fall under the set of Hylians. For another example, red Pikmin and blue Pikmin are, you could say, separate sets, and we could represent them as a Venn diagram, but the two circles are not overlapping, because you can never have an entity who is both a red Pikmin and a blue Pikmin. However, they still both fall within the greater set of Pikmin. Then we get to Boo and King Boo. If we were to represent this as a Venn diagram, then King Boo would be inside the Boo set, because he is a Boo. And that feels weird to have on the chart. The same thing happened earlier in the list with Darunia, Gorkoron, and the Goron. And this isn't as bad as having, say, Mario and Fire Mario, because that's the same character. The circles would be the same circle, which is why Boo and King Boo are still valid, but it's just weird. I feel personally like people should have avoided Boo for the pure ghost type, because I suspect many people shared my feelings about the whole thing and avoided voting for King Boo because they didn't want another Boo. And to be clear, for me personally, I think multiple of the same species in this list is fine. Gorkoron and Darunia are fine in my books. It's only when you introduce Goron that it feels weird. Moreover, I do think that King Boo was still the right choice, and I think there were great options for Pure Ghost, but ultimately the wants of the people are more important than mine, so that's where we land. And hey, I got my Miitopia representation, and some ARMS representation in Master Mummy, so you won't catch me complaining too hard. Other than the fact that I just did. I think the Fairy type is a good place to talk about the Zelda franchise in general, because many people did notice that it got a lot of spaces on this chart. Granted, it didn't get as much as Mario, but seeing as Mario is the biggest video game franchise of all time, and has multiple incredibly prominent sub-franchises which expand the options out by a lot, that's kinda expected. Zelda was always going to get a lot on this list. I don't think people really anticipated how many it would get. I do feel that really interesting additions were passed up for just another Zelda boss at times, but then you could also say that about Mario as well, and I'm gonna have that perception because I'm much more of a Mario fan than I am a Zelda fan. Granted, I feel like people expected Zelda to be much more dominant in the fairy type specifically, but getting almost half the fairy types from one franchise is still a pretty big deal. Palutena beating out Zelda was also pretty unexpected. I think people were saving Zelda for a later type. Mopping up the dragons had a couple of surprises. Rex from Super Mario World makes sense in retrospect because Pure Dragon is kinda hard to imagine. You mean I need a dragon that doesn't fly, breathe fire, or use any sort of magic? While named after a T-Rex, Rex is clearly based on a dragon, but doesn't do any of the aforementioned things, so he actually fits really well. Telethia beat out Light Dragon, which was kinda crazy to me, but Ridley's place had been secure for a long time. After all, he is the most evil dragon in all of Nintendo. And then there was Drago. I thought it was going to be a straight match between him and Min Min, who both seemed perfect in the role, but Min Min fell into 4th place when all was said and done. No, in the end it was such a massive sweep for Drago that he was the first character to break 300 votes. People were confused as to why he, of all characters, managed that. Others were less confused. Now, before I talk about the fighting type, I want to make something very clear. I do not believe my opinion here is the most important or the most correct. Now, with that context out of the way, the fighting type is my favourite type in Pokémon, and so when I started to see this take shape, I don't know man, I was just super disappointed. To be fair, there are some great choices here. Little Mac is a natural pure fighting choice. We got a couple of arms reps, although disappointingly nothing from Joy Mech Fight. Mac felt just so perfect for normal fighting, and a couple of characters were based on sumo wrestlers. There are some great options here, when it isn't just the dumping ground for iconic characters. Like, realistically, look at it. Captain Falcon, Donkey Kong, Samus, Link, Wario. These characters can be justified as fighting types. There are Pokemon that hold the traits they have. There are things they've been seen doing that are in line with what the fighting type does. But these feel like looser stretches. Yes, swordplay can be a part of the fighting type, but very rarely. Yes, the ideas of heroism and justice are there too, but it's more tangential and not core to the type theming. Just being a trained soldier doesn't really feel like it fits the fighting type. More to the point, I feel like most of these just don't embody two types strongly enough, or embody too many types to really be on this chart. I also feel like some amazing character choices got passed up because people wanted to ensure the icons got somewhere on here, and because you can vaguely fit most characters to the fighting type if you try hard enough, that's exactly what happened. Like, Aaron Ryan isn't a character I knew a massive amount about before this list, but when people pointed out how much he fights dirty, he felt truly perfect as a pick. But him getting on there would have meant Wario not making the list at all, and so that's who ended up being chosen. And to me that feels, I don't know, just like it makes the entire thing pointless. What's the point of asking about the characters fitting the types if the types are less important than how popular the character is? The same goes for Steel Fighting. There are so many brilliant options. Arms has a bunch of robots or characters with mechanical elements. Joy Mech Fight is about combat robots, so is Custom Robo, and the heck, Harry from Teleroboxer. I've already talked about how poorly fitting Samus is to this typing in my opinion, but I think what makes it more stark is the fact that there were so many amazing options outside of her that fit better than her. Same goes with Fairy Fighting. There's a couple of Arms characters who use magic. Literally magical boxers. How is that not the epitome of Fairy Fighting type? Firefighting going to Captain Falcon was admittedly pretty funny, but there's a Joy Mech Fight character who is literally made of fire. Granted, Joy Mech Fight was never going to make this list, but still. Donkey Kong, I'll admit, with the benefit of hindsight, feels like he didn't take a slot from a massively more fitting option, but it's yet another character that doesn't really feel like he fits the type all that well. On his own, he'd be fine. With all the others, it just feels weird. Now, ultimately, I don't think there were any decisions that were made here that were the wrong ones, because, Well, the entire point of this is meant to be to see what the people choose. It can't be wrong when the entire question is what do people think would fit this type? That would be nonsense. I can disagree with the decisions and strongly state that, but ultimately that's just my opinion and there's plenty I disagree with, but it doesn't make me right about that. It's just that this is my favourite type. A few oddball choices in a type is fun. Seeing Professor E. Gadd in the Ghost type was funny, for example, and Agatha and Louis being in Bug type is a stretch because they aren't bugs, but they were the only ones really, so it doesn't feel too bad. But so much of the fighting types being full of characters that not only don't feel like the best fit, but also frankly some of the more boring options. I don't know man, it feels bad, and it also just feels like a missed opportunity. Okay, I'm definitely absolutely done complaining about the fighting type and won't bring it up at all in the rest of the video for sure. Anyone who has come here from Reddit knows exactly what's going to happen. The psychic type obviously only really occurred for 2 days, as all the other typings had been done in the previous type sections, and there isn't a massive amount more to say about the choices in general, but Katrina especially was interesting because she only won quite late in the day and after being in 3rd place for a pretty long stretch of time. But what made this personally heartbreaking was that Sabrina from Pokémon was leading before that. Pokémon in this list was a very long tail full of disappointment. Obviously, the Pokémon themselves were not allowed, but the Pokémon trainers were, and throughout the list, I and many others tried to get a Pokémon trainer on the list. From Ghetsis and Giovanni in Normal Dark, to Lucamine in Normal Poison, AI Turo in Steel Psychic, and so on. But none of these ended up winning. Most didn't even get close. Yet, Sabrina, for most of the day, seemed to be on track to win, with Zelda being her only competition, but still definitely behind. But then, as the day went on, Katrina was starting to get more votes, slowly but surely, likely as a result of her climbing up the post as her votes surpassed other characters. And eventually it became clear she was taking the crown from Sabrina. Pokémon is, as far as I can tell, the only major franchise that didn't get a winner in this chart. Ice Climbers got 2. I suspect that many people genuinely just had an aversion to the idea that the Pokémon characters should even count, seeing as types are canon to that universe, but Sabrina garnered so much support because she was among the best fits even if you removed her from her franchise and the context that she's a psychic type trainer. But it just wasn't enough, not quite. Oh yeah, and Gygus won psychic type. I don't think that's overall very surprising. And then we came to the final day. As of the release of this video, that was yesterday. As of the recording of this video, it's actually today. We all knew who it was going to be. Ganondorf. Who else could possibly have filled that space? He's literally the reincarnation of the embodiment of evil and is also one of Nintendo's most iconic villains in arguably their most critically acclaimed and beloved franchise. It was never gonna be anyone else. Although Dark Matter did seem like he could potentially threaten the crown considering this was posted 15 minutes after he was teased for Kirby Air Riders, but he had to settle for second in the end. A very, very distant second. And that's that. It took pretty much half a year, but that is all the characters that will be assigned to each Pokemon type combination. And so, when all's said and done, the full chart with every character looks something like this. So yeah, I expanded this concept just a little. I know I said I was treating primary and secondary types as the same, but a few people mentioned early on that they wished there was a runners-up section, so I figured I might as well put the second place characters as the swapped type combination. For example, Goma may be our fire bug type thanks to coming first in that post, but Fiery Bulblax came second, so why not make that our bug fire type? So I want to go through some of the more notable runners-up. Of course, I still didn't allow repeats, so typically, if a character was in second place for more than one type, I'd put them in for the type they scored highest in of those second places, and then choose the next highest character for the type they didn't get chosen for. I'm going to go through the types in the same order, as that's just how I created the images for them, but I may as well skip the grass type because, being the first type we encountered, there isn't anything new to talk about. I will, however, start with the runners-up for the monotypes, as I did try to shove these at the side of the full chart because it'd feel really weird to miss them out. The pure types were some of the most voted for typings. I guess being the representative of a type as a whole is something a lot of people wanted to see represented by a character they love. We have some pretty cool additions here. The Screwbot and Starfy give us a couple of franchises that never made the top spot in the winners list. I actually think a lot of these runners-up are kinda cool and quirky. Vars being a literal planet, Larkitu's Cloud and Perfect Snowboy being really unexpected, and even Whacker got in there after getting voted in a few categories. Also, Squitter does get on here in this form, so no one can be too mad at Ant for taking the Pure Bug place. I love that the Mario Odyssey T-Rex got second place for Pure Dragon, such a goofy addition. And, of course, you've already seen it, Sabrina is our second place Psychic type. Pokemon got on the list after all, and that makes me happy. I'm going to briefly talk about the Fire type, as obviously there's only one difference in this chart, but it's a difference I think actually has a lot of relevance as we go through. Fire Piranha Plant was Fire Grass type. Remember, species variants are allowed, hence why all the Pikmin were allowed to make it in, and when it came to second place grass types, the Piranha Plants were the true successor to the Pikmin. Frost Piranha Plant, PT Piranha, Bone Piranha Plant, and Dino Piranha all made it into second place in their individual types too, as well as Piranha Plant itself obviously being Grass Dark's winner. It took until the last day of Grass type for the Piranha Plant to get any representation at all, but behind the scenes they were making moves. Kombu was a surprise one for Water Grass, although frankly there was less options there than I expected. And it and Blue Pikmin got far more than any other character did for that combo. And I had never even heard of the Enraged Fireplug before. Plus I was not happy about having to work with such a low quality image. Normal Fire's runner-up was actually specifically Fire Mario, although when Mario got chosen for Pure Normal, that meant that the next runner-up was the one that would fill Normal Fire, and this was Animal Crossing's Phoebe. Deku Scrub was nominated a bunch during the grass type, so to see it take normal grass was nice, and whoever kept suggesting it, rest easy. One of the quirks of the grass type is that because it was early, and because Pikmin was so dominant, a lot of the runner-ups were on very low votes. Take, for example, Electric Grass. Yellow Pikmin was so dominant, 183 upvotes, that the next highest candidate was only at 7 upvotes. And that was Steam Gardener, who later took the Grass Steel winner place, leaving Furore as the runner-up with only 6 upvotes. There were actually quite a few instances of this. I was super happy when I found out that due to both Deku Scrub and Octorok getting more votes elsewhere for second places, Kind Golem from Miitopia was added as our rock grass type. I love Miitopia, so getting that representation there was awesome. Bakun also gave us some Star Fox rep, the first we managed to get at the time, and Shopcake, well, given that Guardian didn't really seem to make much sense for Electric Rock, I think most people would see Shopcake as having been robbed, but getting it here as Rock Electric isn't bad consolation. Also, am I the only one who always thought this was Bald Cleft's nose and not its jaw? Until looking at these large images of them, I always thought it was just a really big nose. There's a few species we would see multiple of in this list, such as Wizrobes, Keys, Taluses. Actually, it's mostly Zelda species. But one I didn't expect was the Sumo Bros. I love them, so don't get me wrong, I'm happy. But seeing both a regular Sumo Bro and a Boss Sumo Bro make the list, both of which are valid individually through subspecies clause, was crazy. And for fairly different types too, Electric Fire and Ground Electric. I was also very proud of getting the Mud Monsters from Wii Fit U's Hose Down game on the list, although I did offer to buy anyone who messaged me a copy of Wii Fit U if it won, so that might have been why. But it only came second, so I'm not duty bound to spend a lot of money on Wii Fit U, and I also get to put it on here. Dylan was pretty heavily requested for a bunch of types across rock and ground, but never took the top spot. But it was good to see him in Steel Ground, although given the Gold Ramgrok was already first for Rock Steel, it wasn't a franchise that was unrepresented. One that was though, oh, this one made me happy. So a couple of months ago, I made a video to document all the research I've done into the Game Seminar games. If you love obscure Nintendo games and lost media, then I would highly recommend watching my video on the matter. But the basic outline is that between 2005 and 2014, Nintendo gave Japanese game design students the opportunity to make their own games, which Nintendo then published, although many of them are now lost media due to them only being distributed for 2 weeks only at DS download stations, exclusively in Japan via DS download play, meaning the game disappears when your DS is turned off. These things are obscure, and while Jikansa Tansa isn't one of the more obscure ones and isn't one of the ones that is lost media, who the heck has actually heard of this game? So when I nominated its protagonist, Penta, for Water Steel, I expected it to just get buried. And then it surprised me by hitting second place and thus being our Steel Water type. This is easily the most obscure character on the entire list, and I'm so happy that it happened, even if it was partially because no one was ever going to try and compete with Flood. Ice type had some solid additions, with Olaf adding another Advanced Wars rep. I think many of them were pretty fun choices, honestly, like Highness, Trinex, Blizzard Midbus, and Francisca just not being characters I would have expected to make it, but second place really is up for grabs in something like this. Not much to say here, I just think it had some cool options. One of the runners-up that I think was really funny was Muckrock. The reason is because this is our poison ground type, and what was the ground poison type that beat it? Sludge-like. You know, the mini-boss that comes before and is less significant than Muckrock. That's just really funny to me, especially after both had already lost to the mud monster for groundwater. The Blue X Parasite was an interesting one, as was Neduron, although some people said that doesn't really fit Poison Rock, and seeing as Broken Joe from Star Tropics would have been the runner-up had it not just got 3 extra upvotes, I think that's a shame. Another potentially unfitting one is Philbot, but hey, anything for a Rhythm Paradise rep. Inkling also made it in here, which is great, and while I had some confusion as to whether it was the same character as regular Krako, I'm fairly sure it's not, so Venom Krako takes Poison Electric. The really funny one to me was Samurai Goro. Technically, the actual vehicle, Fire Stingray, was what it was all based on, but the commenter did make sure to specify that the character they were choosing was indeed Samurai Goro. And the reason? The vehicle is based on a poisonous animal and has fire decal on it. That's kinda hilarious, and this reasoning ended up beating Bowser Jr., Kraid, and Fireblight Ganon. It's so stupid that I actually love it. The flying type had some interesting runners-up, with the electric keys not being one of them, but I personally loved that Akari from 1080 Snowboarding got on there, and it was good to see Meta Knight make the list too. Not much to say here, just solid choices all round. And electric keys. Pikmin did pretty well at second place for the bug types. 6 of the 11 second places on the chart here ended up being from Pikmin. Dragon and Bulkmin both got brought up for a few different types, so it was good to see them get that second place to get on the chart. I also find it interesting that, with Muckrock getting second for Ground Poison and Marbled Goma being second for Rock Bug, the 4 main bosses of Tears of the Kingdom are in the game, if you don't count the Seized Construct. 3 dry enemies from Mario managed to get on through second places in the Ghost type: Bone Piranha Plant, Dry Bones, and Fishbone. Fishbone may have been boosted by his typing being posted the day after the Nintendo Direct where he was shown to be in Mario Kart World. We also got another Goron in Darmani, and Urbosa's here. I'm surprised she didn't win a type, but Riju did. Tingle had been a pretty controversial suggestion for Normal Fairy, considering his whole deal is that he isn't a fairy. I've already mentioned that I personally see normal type combos as a way to represent something that has traits of a type without really being that type, but I don't know that many people would agree with Tingle regardless. It is then very funny that in being the runner-up here, the fairy type becomes his primary type. Not that the swapping of the types really matters, but it feels like he's finally become the fairy he wants to be. Both Tippy and Tiptron get on the chart here, and Daisy was kinda unexpected, but the more I've sat with it, the more I like her as a choice for this. I'm not the biggest Daisy fan, she's actually probably my least favourite of the Mario princesses, but given she is a princess, and I believe she has some sort of magical abilities like Peach, plus the most notable part of Sarasaland, and the one Daisy seems to hail from, is the desert part, this typing makes a lot of sense, but obviously she still came second place. Gonna be honest, I'm not sure what you want from me with the Dragon-type runner-ups. It certainly is a lot of dragons. Obviously we get a few similar ones here like Farosh and Nadra, and Hooktail, Gloomtail and Bonetail all ended up making the chart one way or another. Obviously I already mentioned Dino Piranha, one of the very few who isn't a literal dragon, joined in a similar case by Plessy. And who can forget the Fire Dragon for Fire Dragon? The torch has been passed from Ice Dragon. I don't have much to say about the fighting type runners up that I didn't say earlier in the video. There are some great picks here, especially the redemption of Harry, but most of these just don't feel like fighting types to me. Like Irock? Just because it's a hand? King Dedede? Just because of that one game where he's in a cage match? I don't know. Again, my opinion isn't law, but I do have opinions for sure. But I will say, seeing Pyra actually making the chart in this way was quite nice to see after how much she got shafted in the fire type. Not the type I would have chosen for her, but it is what it is. At least she got there in the end. A couple of Wizrobes being in the psychic type feels a bit but at least Piers from Golden Sun helped us avoid the full trio being in there. Rock Psychic ended up basically just being a bunch of rocks that are somewhat sentient, so that's why we got the Gossip Stone here, obviously being beaten by the Talking Rock. Bizarre type matchup. Lucas actually got a tiny percentage of what Ness ended up getting, but he was still second, so it doesn't matter. Okay, yes, I'll talk about the Goomba. This is one of the most bizarre choices in the entire thing. Why on earth is there a Goomba on this chart in the Psychic Ground type? Well, if you look closely, that isn't any old Goomba. It's the Goomba from Mario Sluggers. The reasoning being that the Goomba is playable in that game and can use the baseball bat, despite not having hands. The conclusion? Clearly a Psychic. This was absolutely a joke answer, but it did indeed get the second highest score, so I had no choice but to put it there. If you're wondering what about the Goomba would be ground type, yeah, so am I. People really latched onto the idea that the Goomba could be ground type, and I'm not sure why, other than the fact that it, stands on the ground. This is bizarre, and, I kinda love it for that. I know that makes me slightly hypocritical because of the fact that I've been complaining about the fighting type this entire video, but shut up. My video, my game. And finally, the second places for the Dark type. I loved Varty getting on the list because I actually beat Minish Cap only a few weeks ago, which is what my next video will be about actually. There was some debate on Gloom Hands. In Tears of the Kingdom, Phantom Ganon appears to be merely a puppet controlled by Ganondorf, and Gloom Hands appears to be just an extension of Phantom Ganon. So do Gloom Hands even count here? Or rather, does their existence contradict Ganondorf also being on the list? Ultimately, it just isn't definitive, so I put them on there. Dark Bowser has no such limitations, as he just straight up isn't Bowser. And then there was Kingfin. Kingfin is literally one vote ahead of Archie from Pokémon. I was hoping Archie would overtake, as I think it would be a cool way to go for a rep here, but it wasn't meant to be. At least we got Sabrina. It's nice that Pokémon managed to get on the list through Sabrina, although there were other franchises I really campaigned to get on the list, especially Joy Mechfight and Dragalia Lost, the latter of which has such brilliant designs for its dragons that I can't believe this is the first I'm seeing them. Ultimately, these are very niche franchises, they were never making it in, but given they feel very much tied to a type in Pokémon, it still would have been great to see them make it. And that's that. I didn't do the Stellar type because Stellar isn't really a type in the same way, and obviously I didn't do the type either, but otherwise I've accounted for every single type combination in the game. It's been a long journey, and I just wanted to say thank you for Slade, I swear, please, just stop adding more work for yourself. So yeah, I decided to add one more little thing onto this. There's a lot of amazing options that were brought up and came nowhere near the top spot. There were a bunch of awesome Pokemon characters that never made it in. Cass as normal flying was suggested way too late in the day, but would have been amazing. And I've already mentioned a character like Broken Joe, who failed to make the list entirely, despite being a better fit than Negeron, and thus Star Tropics was nowhere to be seen here. So I decided that I wanted everyone's suggestions to get some sort of love, and I made a dedicated image for all the suggestions for every specific type combination. This took me so long to do. So a few notes. It's still under the same rules as the main challenge, so no third-party characters, duos, or variants of characters. Well, variants are allowed, but not if the base character is also there. This is going to be very funny in a few minutes, trust me. I put each character in the type combination they got the highest upvotes for, unless the character is already first or second place for another type. So essentially, these are going to be the types that got the most support for these characters. This also includes if a character's only suggestion got it negative downvotes, so there could be some pretty wild additions. Also, there is a chance I've made some mistake and either missed out a character or put a character in the wrong type. Obviously, again, this took me quite a while to do as is, so mistakes are likely to happen. There may also be changes by the time you see this video, either because they changed before I released the video, or because somehow they've changed after the video is released. So there's always going to be a little bit of variance, but this is largely what we're talking about. Oh, and also, if a character got the same amount of upvotes on 2 different posts, I just put them in the first one that they got on. I'm not going to talk about these because frankly there are like 150 and there's not too much to talk about. Plus I'd like to get this video actually finished to release on the last day of the challenge, so I'm just going to have each one up on the screen for a few seconds so that you can see every character that got suggested. Before I do that, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for watching, as this is, even at this point, a pretty long video. But even more than that, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who has contributed to this whole thing at all. This truly would not have worked without all the people contributing and giving ideas every single day, and I'm just very thankful for that. I had an amazing time doing this, and all the work I've put towards it has been worth it to see how much other people have enjoyed it as well. And all that karma I was able to farm. Yummy!